Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of Mapping Global China Conversations. Our series focuses on providing deep insights into China global activities and their impact through discussion with leading experts. And today we are thrilled to have here Dr. Joel Wuthnow and Dr. Phillip Saunders, two eminent scholars in the field of China military and security studies. And they join us today to discuss their newest book, China's Quest for Military Supremacy, that was published last December with Polity Press. And the book is fantastic because it examines the strategic ambitions and challenges of China military advancements in the past decades and give us some thoughts about what will be next. And so welcome both of you and thank you for joining us today. I would like to start with the first question. So in your book, China's Quest for Military Supremacy, which I encourage the public to purchase, you both offer an extensive analysis of the complex landscape of Chinese military power. You both wrote extensively of PLA previously, and I want to ask you what inspired you to write this particular book at this time, and how is it different from previous work?
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks so much, Adele, for having us here on the program to talk about the book. So what inspired us? I think for me, there was just a huge amount of demand and increasing interest in the PLA, in the U.S. in particular, in DoD, Department of Defense, where we work. No longer, I think, is China just purely of interest to a small handful of people, but it's of broad interest to everybody. And our strategies have been changing. Our focus on the Indo-Pacific and on China has been growing. And so because of that, there is a lot of interest in learning more about the PLA from people who have, for a lot of their careers, been looking more at the Middle East and looking at other topics. And so there really isn't this kind of baseline of knowledge about the PLA in the same way that there was a baseline about the Soviet Union back during the Cold War. But the problem was that we didn't think there was a good textbook or basic primer on the PLA that was available for people who wanted to learn about it. And so we saw that there was sort of an opportunity to pull together some threads from our own research, but also from, many others who have been studying different aspects of the PLA over the years, often on very specific areas, but to try to pull that all together into sort of a cohesive text for people, whether it's people in the military or government or people in the general public who are just curious about the PLA to learn about this. So we thought there was an opportunity and sort of the time was right to kind of come up a level from our own research, which is often quite specialized, and to try to do this kind of general purpose book.
I would just add to that the book has a lot of the stuff we've been teaching in our course on the PLA at National Defense University. Joel's been teaching it at Georgetown. I've also been teaching it at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So we kind of wanted to bring the course to a broader public audience.
Wonderful. And I want to ask you, so if you were to kind of say in a nutshell, like how your book contributes to our understanding of the role of the PLA in China's global rise, what would you say?
So I think for me, the contribution is that we haven't really had sort of a general book on the PLA for quite some time. The latest ones are from more than a decade ago, and there's a lot has changed in China in the PLA, especially under Xi Jinping, who has radically changed the way the PLA is organized, and a lot of new hardware, and the PLA has become more of a global actor. And so I think this updates a lot of the knowledge that was there. There are good books about the PLA from more of a historical perspective. But I think what this is trying to do is to bring the story up into the present, but also to look somewhat into the future and ask kind of the question of, well, they're a strong, powerful regional military today, but where are they going to be going into the future? And their plans and their strategies have been evolving. And so to give a bit of the perspective, kind of recent, past, present, and where they're going, I think this kind of sets this particular volume apart from some of the other, very good works, but that are either dated or more specialized today.
Thank you. So I would like now to delve a bit more into the actual book. Can you tell us a bit about the China current capabilities in projecting its military power beyond its immediate region? What have been the main transformation in the past decade or so? And so if you can just tell the public what happened in this past decades, what's the main findings of your book?
Well, if we're looking beyond the region, I would say that they still have a fairly modest global footprint. We don't see beyond Asia more than about 3 or 4 thousand PLA troops at any given time, and they're doing a lot of the same things they have been doing. So think about UN peacekeeping, or thinking about, for example, the counter-piracy patrols that the Navy has been conducting in the Middle East. I think what has changed would be more the capability, if they wanted to project power. So they have now more transport aircraft, more large amphibious ships. So if they wanted to, they could move troops and equipment abroad in a way that they couldn't have done before. But I think what's surprising as a rising power to me is that they've been very strategically disciplined on the region, on the core problems they face within China, with Taiwan, with other regional adversaries. And they've really kept most of their troops close to home, following very in a disciplined way a strategy of projecting power within the region. So they're building, I think, the capacity in the future to do more abroad. But from a political and strategic point of view, they haven't really exercised those options yet. And you might have expected something different from a rising power. Maybe they could have been bolder, but they've actually been somewhat restrained, in my view.
Why do you think is the case that they refrained, they kind of disciplined themselves in not overexpanding abroad, or like showcasing their new capabilities?
So for me, I think, part of it is a recognition that they can't do too many things all at the same time. And so they have a military strategy that is focused first and foremost on the situation across the Taiwan Strait, deterring Taiwan independence and developing the capability potentially for war at some time in the future. And so they've been kind of focused on that because they realize it's very challenging to do that, especially given the prospect or the likelihood of U.S. military intervention. And so they've been having to think how they're going to solve those problems first and foremost. So I think from that point of view, they've had less interest in getting involved in foreign military conflicts or being entangled in foreign disputes. They still have no military alliances. They haven't really sent troops to fight wars on behalf of other countries. And I think that is, it's somewhat surprising for a rising power, or for a great power. We can even call China a great power today, that they haven't really done that, even when they could. If they wanted to, they probably could try to do some of that, but they really haven't. They've avoided it. I think to some degree, they're still actually free riding on the United States to provide stability in key regions where they have important markets, especially in the Middle East. And so to me, that represents the leadership's discipline, their focus, their viewpoint that we have to prepare for the future, because the problems they face at home and in the region are really, really complicated and hard to tackle.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Saunders, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that most of what they've done overseas has been in what we call a fairly permissive environment. There's nobody shooting at the PLA, there's nobody trying to stop them, and often the logistics support has been local. So when they participate in UN peacekeeping missions, the UN's providing logistics support. Now, when they do counter-piracy, they were using commercial ports in the area. Now they're relying some on the Djibouti base to help support that. But they haven't gone to places where they have to project a lot of power, fight against somebody, and sustain it. Joel's right that that's partly a function of strategic discipline. I would say the one thing, and the other thing we see is they practice military diplomacy. So their Navy will sail places, exercise with other countries, notably with the Russian Navy. But again, it's a permissive environment where it's more a show than actual combat operations.
Do you think it has anything to do with its vision of sovereignty, and like the way China presents itself to the world as a peaceful nation that wants to take back its place in the world, the great rejuvenation of the nation, according to Jinping, but before was like China peaceful rise. China is different from other great powers, and the fact that it's kind of defying the expectations probably supports this vision that is portraying of itself. I'm, a developing country. I'm not here to expand my imperial reach in the world. What do you think? Is there again, the fact that it's not following the rising power trajectory, right? Doesn't mean that it really it's this peaceful rise. How would you classify China? I mean, in these terms, I
think that ideological point of view, trying to make the case that China's different, it's not going to be a hegemon, doesn't have military bases, it's not going to behave like other great powers, has been a talking point for China, and it probably has constrained behavior to date. But it's also the case that China's overseas interests and footprint have expanded pretty dramatically. So now they have trade dependencies, notably on oil and gas from the Middle East. They have investments around the world. They have PRC citizens around the world. And that generates kind of a broader pattern of interests and some demand for military capabilities. Thus far, that's been things like evacuating Chinese citizens out of dangerous places or UN peacekeeping type of missions. But the PLA Navy is aware of this dependency on seaborne oil and gas. They've identified protecting China's sea lines of communications as a mission. And to do that, you need a blue water Navy that they're starting to develop. We mentioned the base in Djibouti, which provides a logistics footprint. We mentioned the counter-piracy deployment. Well, they've been there since 2008, and there's not a lot of pirates left in Somalia that are really causing major problems, but the PLA Navy is still there. And part of the point is that gives them an overseas presence. And I think we do see an interest in bases overseas that will improve their ability to project and sustain power. So I think it is true they've been restrained in the past, but I think the amount of Chinese interest toward an expanded realm. So I think we can look for change in the future.
And actually, speaking of China interests abroad and increased global presence, can you tell us a bit more about the Belt and Road Initiative and how the PLA strategy kind of is tied to broader geopolitical goals that are kind of associated to the Belt and Road? Because China now has a lot of people abroad and also a lot of interest, a lot of investments abroad. For instance, the Pakistan economic corridor, there were cases in which Chinese were attacked. And so China had to place some military presence. But it's more sort of a protective, as a shield for its own investments and people rather than a true projection of power. So what are your thoughts about this military strategy, China military strategy vis-a-vis Belt and Road Initiative and global ambitions?
I think for me, the clearest link between BRI and the PLA would be on the maritime, and especially the so-called Maritime Silk Road, because these are important sea lanes that China relies on to import oil and gas, but also just to facilitate commercial trade with Europe, with Africa, and et cetera. And those are sea lanes that they don't dominate. And so they've been very concerned historically about vulnerabilities of disruption of important imports coming into China from the United States or from others. And so part of the Maritime Silk Road, part of BRI, I think, is continuing to build up a network of strategic ports that would allow the PLA Navy to operate somewhat more intensively across the Indian Ocean into as far as the Mediterranean. I think that's still somewhat of an ambition. I don't think that they have today in 2025 a strong ability to patrol maritime choke points far away from China or even within the Strait of Malacca. So I think that's still a vision they have, and it's part of the driver of the buildup of the PLA Navy, I think, one day to protect those sea lanes. But as you say, there's also a protection component on land, so protecting Chinese citizens or investments. But the issue there is that typically speaking, the PLA is not the main responder if those interests come under attack. Usually they're relying on host nations or private security companies, or even in some cases, the UN to safeguard those people. There have been some non-combatant evacuations that the PLA has conducted, such as in Libya back in 2011, but those are very, very rare. Typically, the PLA is the last party that would become involved in those things. And I think, again, that's just a reflection of the fact that they don't really have a modern global military in the sense that we do. We can, let's say, if our embassy comes under attack, we can go in and try to deal with that in a lot of countries. But the Chinese don't have the experience or the global structure or the capabilities to even do that if they wanted to. So they've found that it's very convenient, I think, for the most part, to rely, when it comes to those sorts of tasks, to rely on other people and private and, foreign entities rather than bringing in the PLA.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's kind of the strategy moving forward? Like they're trying to build capabilities to kind of match the US, or that's not even a goal? Can you talk us a bit about the Djibouti case, right? Because that was the first military base overseas. Are we going to see more of those? Because China wants to match US kind of bases, alliances. How is China going to, again, establish its power and project its military power abroad?
Well, they're certainly building up some of the capabilities they would need to project force. There's been a pretty significant increase of production of their long-range transport aircraft, as well as their large deck amphibious ships. And these are useful to transport troops or equipment, and they've been using them of late. However, they haven't constructed the same type of network of bases based in alliances that the U.S. has. And so the Djibouti base is the one and only presently overseas official base of the PLA. And it's relatively small and modest. It's useful for replenishing ships and conducting kind of non-traditional security missions and facilitating military diplomacy, as Phil said. But it's not really in the same category as some of those large so-called iron mountains that the U.S. maintains with munitions and troops and, air defenses and so on that are useful for warfighting purposes. And so they haven't really put that type of architecture into place, I think, again, to return to kind of the central point that they've been so focused on Asia and China itself, but the near abroad, that they haven't really needed to or desire to pay the cost. Those are very expensive things, by the way, to manage an overseas base, to deploy troops, to deal with that. It's expensive. It's potentially a political sensitivity or controversial in those countries. And there's no alliances that would require them to come to the defense of overseas nations to begin with. So they've really avoided going down the route that the U.S. went after World War II. They could do that in the future, but in my view, there would have to be a pretty significant change in the security environment. So let's say, for example, they manage to solve the Taiwan problem, then they have maybe less to lose. In other words, more to gain. In other words, they would be less tied up in the region. But as of today, I think they're satisfied with a fairly modest overseas footprint.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Go ahead.
I would add to that two things. Part of what they're doing now is using commercial port facilities. So when the PLA goes somewhere to do an exercise, they might stop at a commercial port to refuel or reprovision. And that's fine for those kinds of peacetime activities where you're not trying to engage in combat. And most ports will just treat a PLA Navy ship like any other ship. But it won't support combat operations. You can't use that kind of logistics network, informal logistics network, if you're going to send ships somewhere and have them engage in combat, because countries won't necessarily support that if they're not your allies. So I think that's the area that differs. And maybe the one other thing I would say is I think if we see the PLA increasing its military training and military diplomacy activities in Africa, I think we could see bases there partly focused on that training mission. And that might be, cooperative still, not trying to posture the PLA to go do combat missions, but supporting a more permanent presence in the Africa region.
Thank you. Dr. Saunders, I want to ask you a question. So let's shift a bit to Xi Jinping, because Xi Jinping has brought huge shift with the military. And so how the PLA reforms under Xi Jinping altered China's approach to national and international security? What have been the major transformation that you've seen?
I think the major transformation is that the PLA has long had a doctrine of fighting jointly. So, with the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy all working together in a synergistic way. And they've also had a focus on using information. So, using intelligence systems to learn where the adversary is, pushing that information in centralized ways, and using it to make their regular combat forces more effective. What Xi Jinping has done is a couple things. He reorganized the military to promote jointness. So now you have theater commands, which are joint commands, and they command the Army, Navy, and Air Force and conventional missile force units all under one command. That greatly facilitates them working together. He added new information support forces to collect and transmit information. So you have a cyberspace force that's managing cyber assets. You have an aerospace force that's managing satellites. You have this information support force, which is transferring information all along. So you have an organizational revolution to collect this information, process it, and get it directly to the combat units. And then finally, I think the third thing that he's done is he's really emphasized training for combat. That the PLA, it's not good enough to have a scripted exercise where you go and parade around and you sort of show off the force. He has driven the PLA to set kind of much more realistic training, often what we call opposition force training. So it's one group of the PLA training against another group, and to have much tougher criteria and evaluation of those kind of exercises. So it's much more demanding, helps build combat skills, and that's been a consistent focus of his leadership, that the PLA has to be prepared to fight. So he's reorganized the PLA to do it, and he's insisted that they have their training set up to build those combat skills, which is important because the PLA hasn't really engaged in combat since 1979. So there's not a lot of real combat experience, and what there is only at very senior levels of the force. So the training has to be better and more realistic if you're going to build that capability in the military.
The only thing I would add to that is that he's made the PLA more joint, but he's also shifted the way the PLA is composed in terms of the services. When he came in power back in 2012, the Army was really quite dominant. They had about 70% of the PLA was Army guys. But that was totally out of line with what they were trying to do. I mean, if you think about a Taiwan conflict, very important for the air domain, the maritime, the cyber, and all of this. And so he realized that the Army was way too bloated. And the first thing he did was to cut 300,000 people out of the Army. And now they're less than half of the PLA is ground forces. And so overall, I think he's tried to do that, and he's tried to make the PLA more capital intensive, relying more on, sort of high quality equipment and less on large numbers of people. And that's consistent with what he's trying to do from a warfighting and deterrent point of view, which is to have a very high capable, high caliber military, but not necessarily fight or think about, a low tech, protracted war. That's what the PLA was trying to do back in the Cold War, and that persisted a bit, and the Army was very powerful. But the fact that he was able to, in some way, kind of break the back of the big Army mentality, as he calls it, I think that was just a testament to his ability to cut through the bureaucracy and be sort of a disruptor of the PLA.
Speaking of which, so kind of getting rid partly of a big army and people, and advancing instead also technology. So technology will play a crucial role in the future warfare. So technology like AI, quantum computing, hypersonics. And so how do you see this technology influencing the PLA strategies moving forward, and also China military capacity? Do we have to be really worried about it? What are your thoughts on this?
My view is that there's certainly a global diffusion of military technology at play right now, and all of the major powers are trying to harness that, including the U.S., including China, and others. And so it's completely unsurprising that the PLA has tried to make sense of this, sort of global military technological revolution. And they've been talking about integrated artificial intelligence and advanced computing and even things that are on the drawing board like quantum computing and nanotechnology and advanced material. I mean, they're thinking these thoughts just as we are. And I think there is a question of kind of who gets there first, who's going to have those advantages at their disposal in terms of fielded forces first. If you're talking about hypersonics, I think the PLA has already gotten there first, and they have very advanced missile forces. And to some degree, the West is sort of playing catch up. But if we're talking about, applications of AI or other things, there isn't necessarily a clear advantage quite yet. But I think that, we should be prepared to see the PLA acquire such technology if they're able to and use it. And there's a lot of different applications of that. For example, with AI, if you're able to integrate that into your sensing across the Pacific, you can improve the efficiency of your ability to differentiate targets very well. So it becomes harder if you're trying to hide in the Pacific Ocean, but they can scan the entire ocean in an instant, and there's your ship. So that could be very dangerous, I think, for stability if someone can get that advantage first. But I think, again, it's many of these things are still on the drawing board. There are definitely problems in their system related to, can the military actually draw from the civilian side? And there have been roadblocks. In other words, sort of the civilian developing advanced things, but the military being very closed and non-competitive and not wanting to actually develop those partnerships. And she has tried to break through some of that through what he calls military civil fusion. And I think it's had probably some degree of success, but that's still, in my view, sort of a hindrance in their system. They don't have the exact type of system that we would in encouraging kind of private public partnerships to leverage those advanced disruptive technologies.
Mhm. Can you tell us a bit more about civil military integration? How is it different from the US? And how does this integration affect, again, China capacity to project its power abroad? I mean, you touch upon this, but can you elaborate a bit more for lay people? What is this?
Yeah, so we sort of sometimes use the phrase civil military integration. They use a phrase that's often called kind of military civil fusion. And there's different meanings of this phrase. In US discussions, we're often talking about the PLA's ability to acquire advanced technology that's being built, sort of like in their version of Silicon Valley. And it has been an issue for Xi and his predecessors who have talked about this precisely because their defense industry has been closed off from kind of their version of Silicon Valley. They don't cooperate very much. The talent doesn't go back and forth. The basic science and technology doesn't necessarily transfer into the PLA. And so he's trying to find ways to cut the red tape to improve, talent. So you could work for the PLA, but be in a research lab, or you can, share the technology more easily. So he's trying to cut through the red tape and probably is having some level of success. You could think, for example, in areas like drones where, you have DJI building the drones, but the PLA maybe is using them. But there's other connotations as well. And there's a broader point here, which is that the PLA is very separated from the civilian state and the civilian economy in general. And that's very inefficient for them. And so there's another connotation that has to do with kind of mobilization and logistics. And they're trying to find ways where the PLA can actually procure more of what they need, whether it's high tech or low tech or anything else, but procure that stuff from the civilian side in a very straightforward way. And we're seeing some examples of successes of that. But I think this is sort of a general goal, is to break down some of the walls and silos around the PLA to get better cooperation with civilians in general for efficiency purposes, but also in some cases for technology and talent purposes. But the fact they keep raising this as an issue signals to me that they think they have a pretty significant problem on their hands.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I think some of your findings, so it's a kind of, you don't fully know because it's very hard to gather accurate data on what China is doing military, or like what Xi Jinping is really thinking. This is a question I wanted to ask you before, but like, what were the key challenges in gathering data on China's military capabilities and ideologies, strategies, and so forth? Like, what data did you rely mostly in this research, and what were the main challenges?
I think this type of research, you have to be very eclectic. I don't think you can just rely on one data source. So there's some examples of sort of big data collection and analysis in this book. For example, the work that in particular Phil has been doing on PRC military diplomacy over the last 20 years, but collecting that from newspapers from China and from other countries, and then aggregating it and then developing that into trends and analysis. That's one example. On pieces that are more related to doctrine and operational thinking, there are some pretty good high quality books from the PLA that we have access to, that we use, that we read, and some of them are updated. Like, for example, the 2020 Science of Military Strategy is a fairly good source on things like leadership priorities. You know, they give speeches. Xi Jinping instructs the PLA what he wants them to do. It's not purely propaganda, because he's talking in speeches to his own people about what his priorities are, and he has to use those communication channels to clarify what he wants them to do. And so we have some indication of what their priorities are. And then data on what they're spending. It's very difficult to know exactly how much they're spending because they're not transparent with their budgets. But there's a lot of good analysis out there on that. The fielded capabilities that they have, there's some, relatively good data out there from places like SIPRI and others, who are looking at hardware and looking at training exercises and seeing how that stuff's being used. So again, we have to be eclectic, and there are good scholars who are working, who have very narrow portfolios, but people who kind of spend their whole lives studying the PLA ground forces or the PLA Air Force. And we try to bring that and make it more accessible to general readers in this volume. And then finally, we do have some ability to talk to the PLA directly, through the exchanges that we have with them, to try to understand, for example, what's motivating your military reforms and what challenges are you facing? Some of the answers we get are occasionally rather illuminating from them. And so anyway, we try to bring all of this together and put it together in a way that's, relatively easy or accessible for average readers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's move to one of the biggest issues, Taiwan, and the possibility of a conflict that is frequently brought up in discussions about China. So what are your thoughts on U.S. China war over Taiwan, especially given the new U.S. administration? Is there going to be a war anytime soon? I mean, because we've been hearing this for the past decade, right? And but there's not been a war. But what is the status now? Like, how China is preparing? Is it realistic to expect a war in the coming 5 years to 10 years?
Well, nobody knows the answer with confidence, and I think there's a whole spectrum of opinion ranging from war is imminent to war is impossible. I think what we're observing would be that the PLA is serious about preparations for conflict. It's clear to me that Xi Jinping has given them a milestone to be ready for a war by 2027. And they've made some progress towards that as well. Just if you look at some of the hardware they've been building, the exercises they've conducted to be more prepared for this kind of thing. However, the fact that she has to give them a deadline, I think, signals that Xi Jinping himself realized that they weren't very capable of these sorts of operations, even as late as, maybe a few years ago, and maybe even today. And so what are some of the major challenges they're facing? I mean, number one, Taiwan does have some geographic advantages. It's an island. It's separated by 100 nautical miles. It's not like Ukraine is right next to Russia, so Russia can just roll tanks across the border. But they do have some geographic advantages. Their topography is very challenging, I think, for an invasion force to operate across. There are other military challenges. As Phil noted, the PLA lacks combat experience. They are new as a joint force. And things like an island landing would be not basic entry-level jointness. That would be the pinnacle, like the most extremely challenging thing. And even for the U.S. in World War II, it was very hard to do those sorts of things. And we had a lot of combat experience. And so for the PLA, they're coming with a fresh set of eyes. And so I think it's a kind of a confidence factor weighing on them, but not only from the military point of view. I think they realize, based on the West's reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that they are going to be heavily, heavily sanctioned and cut off from the West if they ever do this. And so even if they get to the point where they are confident in their military capabilities, which they may be increasingly confident, but not there yet. But even if they get to that point, I think they still realize that there's a heavy, heavy price to pay. So strategically, there's a lot of factors pushing against this. However, what we're also seeing would be an uptick in options short of war. So coercive activities around Taiwan, kind of quasi-blockade-like exercises, a whole lot of airplanes, coming very close to Taiwan. And so I would evaluate a lot of this both as training for a war, but also as psychological pressure on Taiwan not to cross China's red lines, not to, go towards independence, and also as messaging to the United States not to trifle with China on its, most central core interest.
Thank you. What were the most surprising findings while you did your research, or like in this past years, like a decade, studying China PLA?
Well, I mean, there are surprises, but they cut in both directions for me. On the capabilities side, I mean, I've been surprised just at the rapid pace of their expansion in the last decade or so. And you can look at that in terms of missile forces, or in terms of naval ships, or in terms of, even, we haven't touched yet on the nuclear buildup, but just the pretty significant buildup of nuclear warheads and delivery systems for China. So their ability to do that, the innovation they've demonstrated already, and they've revealed some pretty significant capabilities. Most recently, a new generation of kind of fighter bombers that they're kind of rolling out, the sixth generation. So they have a lot of, these sorts of things that surprise Western observers, I think. On the other hand, though, I think I've also been surprised at the continuation of problems in the PLA related to kind of political, or related to corruption. So Xi Jinping tried to clean house back when he came in, and he took out a lot of generals that were corrupt and that were also his rivals. But if you look over the last couple of years, he's had to clean house again and take out some very senior people in sensitive roles. The rocket force leadership, a couple of defense ministers, some members of the Central Military Commission, all had to be purged. And that was very surprising to me, and to probably, a lot of people who had thought that he was really in charge of things. But his inability to really truly get the PLA under control with their spending and with other questions that we don't even have good insight into, that's kind of cut the other way as a surprise. So they're capable, they're modern, and they've impressed everybody, but they've also surprised people with their inability to really get their house in order.
Interesting.
If I can add one thing there, I think it's been the progress in the Chinese defense industry. So when I started watching the PLA many years ago, it basically was obsolete. Its equipment dated from the Soviet era in the 1950s, and it was only modestly improved. And in the early 1990s, they were just starting to buy modern systems from Russia and build some of their own. And I think there was a sense that while buying from Russia might get them into what it means to be a modern military, their own defense industry couldn't produce those things. And I think that's been a big change, that today they have absorbed a lot of that Russian technology. They have gotten access to Western technology through both legitimate means and espionage. And their defense industries are producing at a much higher level. So they make very capable ships today. They make very capable aircraft today. The engines are still a problem. Very capable air defenses today. So the progress they've made in their defense industries has helped them build a modern military operating, maybe not state-of-the-art weapons, but pretty capable modern systems. And that supported a big, big improvement in PLA capabilities. And it's
Mhm.
also made them less dependent on imported parts and foreign suppliers than they were in the early 90s.
Thank you. And so, what would you recommend to the US, to the current administration? Because I think one side, like, it's kind of so concerned about China threat and enlarge, make this China threat looks like huge. And then some other kind of downplay the capacities of China, looking just at AI, right? That everybody, the world was surprised when DeepSeek came up, like with similar capabilities with with the Western counterpart. What do you think should be the kind of posture of the US towards China and all this development that suddenly it's kind of will overtake us, and the fear that it might overtake us in the future? How should we prepare?
I think for me, part of the answer is that we don't want to get into an escalating arms race with China. We have to have some baseline of stability in this relationship. And we don't want to go in the direction of the Cold War and the massive buildups. It's terribly expensive. I think if you look at the financial picture, China is actually you could make the case that China is in a more favorable position to do well in an arms race than we are because they're not spending very much of their GDP so far on the military. They're spending a lot of money in absolute terms, but in relative terms, I think they could afford a larger mobilization and a larger buildup. And so I think we have to be very careful about that. And of course, there's always the prospect of accidents and miscalculations. I think we've had somewhat productive conversations with them so far about for example, nuclear decision making, and those should continue. But that being said, I think that the administrations of both parties are right to focus on, deterrence of great power aggression in the Indo-Pacific. This is a theater of massive importance to the global economy and to the United States, and we don't want to see what has happened in the European theater happen in Asia. And so the policy debate is about how best to achieve deterrence. Do you deter through a huge military, buildup? Do you deter through economic means? Do you somehow try to reassure at the same time that you're deterring through military means? And so these are important questions. But I think that, it's the right question to ask. I do think that both parties and both administrations have had some success. I think China has been restrained. Xi Jinping has not been like Putin. He hasn't gone to war with anybody for 12 years. And I think part of the reason for that is because he realizes the massive cost to his own economy. So there's actually in a surprising way, there's some benefits to economic integration with China because it gives them more to lose. If we completely cut them off from from the US from trade, then they have less to lose and more to gain through force. But we also have to continue within our limited financial means and through our allies to continue to confront them with real military consequences if they ever were to use force against either Taiwan or one of our allies.
Thank you. I would also love to end it with these recommendations, which I think it's quite different from what we hear, right? Because now there's all this decoupling from China, but that might not be in our best interest, even to win over China, right? Because we acquire some strength by integrating and by interdependence. So let's move to the question about the PLA role developing within China global strategy over the next 10, 20 years. One last thought.
Um, I think it's going to expand marginally. One of the things about Xi Jinping is he sees all kinds of threats to China. And
Mm,
some of those are military threats, but a lot of them are economic threats or political threats or environmental threats or information threats. So that's one of the things we talk about in the book is that his threat perceptions are very broad and military threats are only a part of that. I think one of the things that has changed in recent years is talking about the need for security and military power to protect China's economic development. And that's a
mm,
big shift because it used to be under Deng Xiaoping, military modernization was the fourth of the four modernizations. It was subordinate to the economy. Now there's been a change in how they think about it to say that, well, you've got to have military power to protect the right to development. And so that implies a greater role for the military and strategy. I think the place where that might manifest is in concerns about energy security and sea lanes of communications. So I think that's one big question for me, is whether we'll see more of an emphasis on that in the future. As Joel said, right now the focus is regional, and Taiwan and maritime territorial disputes in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. If some of those things are resolved, then I think you might see a China that looks more globally and a PLA that starts to look more globally.
Would this global, like new global PLA that is emerging, be also more imperialistic? Will they start to get territory? Like, Trump, we hear, wants to get Panama, Greenland. Like, do you see that happening with China? Is there anything that can reassure us about that once China solved its own more kind of regional issues and questions, or not? We should be concerned.
I don't think it's expansionist in that sense. They have a specific set of territorial concerns: Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, some on the border with India and Bhutan. So I don't think you're going to see a China that's trying to conquer and invade other countries. But what I think is a possible outcome is some of these Chinese interests start to require more of a military presence overseas, and they decide right now that's not their first choice, partly because they lack capabilities, partly for political reasons. But they start to think some of these overseas interests, there really is more of a military role, not necessarily fighting, but having a presence more of a presence overseas to deter things from happening, to shape the regional security environment overseas. And I think that's what might drive a bigger PRC presence. I don't think they would do it in the way that the United States has done it. And as Joel said, not necessarily with that kind of big global base network. But especially if they're able to solve some of their regional problems, then you might see an expanded military presence overseas.
So thank you very much for our guest today. And please buy the book, because it's it's fascinating account of the most recent developments of China military. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting us.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you.